Okay, we have quite a few people on the call already, so we'll kick it off. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon to discuss the Petrochemical Investor Statement, a call to action ahead of the Global Plastics Treaty. My name is Nicole Kozłowski, and I'm the head of engagement here at Planet Tracker. Today, we will explore key insights for financial institutions on the Global Plastics Treaty and how supporting the Petrochemical Investor Statement can drive action to end plastic pollution. You will hear not only from me, but also from my colleague Richard Wielechowski, who is heading the Petrochemicals and Plastics Research here at Planet Tracker. So let's have a look at what we will cover today. We will start by exploring what environmental and health issues plastics are causing. We will then dive deeper into the role of petrochemicals and the life cycle of plastics. Afterwards, we will look at what risks are associated with plastic pollution and what specific risks investors in the plastic value chain are exposed to. And then we will cover the regulatory landscape and recent developments in the policy arena, so looking at the Global Plastics Treaty. And lastly, and probably most importantly, we will discuss how investors can mitigate these environmental, social, and financial risks and get involved in the investor statement, which many other asset managers and asset owners have signed already. Some very quick housekeeping. If you do have any questions, please add them in the Q&A. We'll try and pick them up and answer them in the chat or after the presentation. But in case we can't get back to you on the webinar, we will reply via email later on. And also just to note that this webinar is being recorded. So before we kick it off, I wanted to take just one brief minute to introduce Planet Tracker to those of you who aren't familiar with our work. Planet Tracker is a sustainable finance think tank conducting research on nature-related risks and opportunities. We are a group of ex-financial markets and environmental professionals and provide in-depth research reports on the drivers of biodiversity loss and their financial materiality. We are a not-for-profit, so everything that we do is for the common good, and all of our research is publicly available, and you can find it on our website. As part of the work that we do, we focus on materials, and we have a dedicated program on plastics and petrochemicals, which leads us to today's topic. So let's dive into it and discuss the issues that plastics are causing. Petrochemical companies are a major contributor to plastic production. We'll discuss this in more detail after this slide, but petrochemical companies take fossil fuel feedstocks and convert them into polymers, which are the building blocks of plastics. And the trajectory of the production of plastics is what is alarming. Plastic production is expected to more than double, under some scenarios even triple, if you look at OECD figures by 2060. And without a significant course correction, the impact on our environment, on the climate, and on public health will be devastating. But the petrochemical industry is determined to keep production growing. Seeing a decline in demand for fossil fuels for energy purposes, petrochemical companies have identified plastics as its plan B. The industry is banking on plastics as the primary growth area to maintain profitability. And despite the growing body of evidence pointing to the harmful impacts of plastics, plastic producers continue to resist efforts to reduce production. Their strategy often involves framing the solution as one that rests solely on improving recycling and waste management, deflecting attention from the core issue, which is the ever-increasing production of plastics. So let's look at a few issues that plastics are causing. For one, plastics release greenhouse gas emissions. Life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from plastics are set to more than double, reaching 4.5% of global emissions by 2060 under a business as usual scenario. Plastics can be toxic. Plastics contain more than 16,000 chemicals, and out of the 5,800 chemicals which have been tested, over 4,000 are known to be toxic, so that's over 70%. These chemicals can leach into the environment at every stage of the plastic life cycle, so from production to disposal, and pose a risk to all of us. Which leads me to my next point, which is that plastics can make us sick. Toxic chemicals and additives have an impact on human health and are, among other health issues, associated with diabetes, obesity, fertility issues, and different types of cancers. And dealing with these issues is expensive. Human health costs in the US alone in 2015, resulting from exposure to just 3 commonly used chemicals in plastics, have been estimated at $675 billion. So that gives us a bit of an idea why we need to tackle plastic pollution. But what is the role of petrochemicals in the life cycle of plastics? I'll hand over to my colleague Richard to answer that question.
Thanks very much, Nicole. So, as Nicole mentioned, petrochemical companies sit as the tap spewing out plastics. You would have seen it on the previous slide. It's a great visual, but it also helps us understand that role. They are the tap pumping out the raw material of plastics, which is then used by the likes of the packaging manufacturers, who are then feed it on to the likes of the FMCG players. So on this slide, we highlight the petrochemical players in the left-hand box as the upstream segment of the plastic value chain. Their production is then used by companies in the midstream, those making containers and packaging. And that is then passed on, as I say, to the downstream players such as FMCG companies. Now, it's important to note that petrochemical companies are embedded in this value chain, and thus the problem of plastic pollution. Too often, the focus for addressing plastic pollution is only on that right-hand side of the chart. Let's get the FMCG companies to use less plastic. Let's make consumers recycle more. But it's more than that. And I think what we have to acknowledge is the critical role in the production of plastics means that petchem companies and their financiers are exposed to the growing risks associated with the challenge of plastic pollution, as we'll see over the next few slides. And first of all, let's have a look at regulatory developments. There's been a steady increase over the past decade or so in the number of national level policies focused on addressing plastic pollution. This is something that consumers, governments are starting to pay attention to. It's costing them money, it's ruining the environment. They're really starting to focus on it. We've seen laws banning certain single-use plastic items. These increasing national efforts have really set the ground for the international work on the issue, the Global Plastic Treaty, which we'll talk about more later in the presentation. Now, these regulatory developments and also litigation risk interact with reputational risk, as we show on the next slide, and consumer awareness to mean we do not believe business as usual is an option for petrochemical companies. They cannot continue what they're doing because they're going to face governmental regulation at national levels, international regulation, risk of litigation, consumer awareness and pushback, customers starting to ask questions about what they're doing, and that risks the reputation of their brands. Now, at the moment, we don't believe these risks are appropriately appreciated or priced into the plastics industry, and we think that represents a risk to the investors in this sector. Now, as an example of the potential mispricing, we zoom here into the litigation risk that I mentioned. That, as Nicole mentioned, there's a huge range of chemicals involved in the manufacture of plastics, many of which are known to be harmful to health, others of which are untested. This knowledge gap is being filled. As we show on the right-hand side of this slide, there's been an explosion in the level of academic work looking at the human health impacts of chemicals associated with plastics. Now, in many ways, this is a ticking time bomb for the industry. How long before these analyses start to crystallize into actual legal challenges and potentially huge payouts? If you think that basically the whole global population is potentially exposed to negative harms from plastics and plastic-associated chemicals, this could be a major headwind. As we note on the left-hand side of the slide, we are maybe starting to see the first rumbles of this potential earthquake in recent years. Now, for those of you who are interested in exploring this further, I'd recommend our recent report on novel entities as a starting point. Like all our research, it's available for free via our website. Now, let's move on and discuss where we stand on the Global Plastic Treaty. Now, firstly, just for anyone who's not aware, let's take a step back and talk about what the Global Plastic Treaty is. So the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, or INC, on plastic was created by the UN Environment Programme, UNEP. The treaty, which it is working towards, aims to create an internationally legally binding instrument to address plastic pollution both on land and also in the marine environment. The instrument has the goal of addressing the environmental and health harms associated with plastic. However, despite 4 rounds of negotiations so far, there remains a number of contentious points which remain to be decided. Most notably, these centre on the scope of the treaty and whether it should include focus on production reduction or only on waste management. That point I was making earlier about it, only some people saying it should all be about recycling rather than about the entire value chain. And of course, plastic producers would like the focus to be on waste management rather than production curbs. There's also disagreement about how to address chemicals of concern in plastic and how they impact the environment and human health. As we discussed earlier, there's growing scientific work on the threat of these chemicals, and this is a potential litigation time bomb for the sector. Finally, there remains debate on how efforts to address plastic pollution should be financed. The industry has generally pushed back against the concept of a tax on volumes, for instance, but governments are starting to realise plastic is a huge cost to them, running waste management, dealing with these mountains of waste that are being produced. So where are we on the process of agreeing a global plastic treaty? So negotiations kicked off in 2022, and there's so far been 4 rounds of negotiations, with the latest concluding in Canada at the end of April. The 5th round is scheduled for Busan, Korea in November, very end of November into the start of December, when it's hoped the treaty will be finalised and then can be signed off in 2025. Now, let's have a look at the latest updates. As I mentioned, there's quite a lot of controversial areas still to be discussed, but it hasn't been a case that negotiators have been sitting on their hands in between the actual meetings. We've seen a number of positive indicators for progress in the intervening months since Canada concluded at both the national level and the corporate level. Firstly, at the national level, 28 countries signed the Bridge to Busan Declaration, which includes calls for a reduction in primary plastic polymer production alongside other measures to tackle pollution. Signatories include the likes of the EU, the UK, Chile, and Nigeria. Separately, the US has also stated that it backs a global target to reduce plastic production, so it looks like a number of governments are starting to get behind an ambitious treaty. Now, the Bridge to Busan Declaration has also been signed by the Business Coalition for a Global Plastics Treaty. This group includes global investors, NGOs, major plastic packaging producers, and consumer-facing brands. CEOs of major corporate members of this group have also signed an open letter calling for an effective treaty, which would include elements such as addressing chemicals of concern and extended producer responsibility schemes. Now, in our view, this underlines growing corporate support for an ambitious treaty and effective global regulation of plastic pollution impacts. Now, finally, negotiators have been working to try and smooth the roadblocks to progress encountered at INC4. There have been intersessional working groups looking at the contentious issues, and it's hoped that that will ease INC5 in the negotiations that are expected when we go to Korea. So moving on to what are the potential implications of a treaty for investors. First, if a treaty gets adopted, countries will transpose it into national legislation, therefore impacting activities around plastic manufacture and the chemicals that are being used in the processes. Those new policies and regulations will have direct impact on business operations that are currently taking place. Now, depending on the level of ambition of the treaty, producers could face new limits both on their production of plastic volume in volume terms, their emissions of greenhouse gases or toxins, and both of those could impact the way that they're operating their business and the investment that's needed in, for instance, the factories and plants that they're running. They may also be pushed to change the way they produce and what they produce. For instance, they may need to phase out certain additives. Are these available? Will they have to spend R&D to develop these alternatives? They also could face a change in the nature of any subsidies that they've received in the past. Maybe they'll be, instead of just being handed out, they'll be aligned with greening production, making this transition. They may also incur extra taxes to help fund plastic waste management. As I mentioned, governments are starting to realise this is not a cost that they want to bear themselves. And downstream actors can also be impacted. It's not just necessarily the plastic producers, because new types and regulations around waste management might impose factors around product design, about need for recyclability, and the need for things like extended producer responsibility. Now, the petrochemical companies that we're targeting with the statement are very aware of the potential threat to a comprehensive global plastic treaty, and they've been increasing their efforts to shape the negotiations. And this sits alongside their ongoing efforts to lobby against or water down any national level regulation. At INC4 in Canada, there was a 37% increase in the number of petrochemical linked lobbyists and industry representatives versus the prior negotiating round. That's an analysis by SEAL. This really underlines that the industry is stepping up its obstructive tactics as the treaty nears completion. And that's a critical area that investors, the owners of these companies, can engage on. These lobbying efforts confirm that petrochemical companies know that regulation is a risk to business as usual. We see increasing regulation as one of the key risks to investors, and it's something that should be focused on. Companies that are making a transition, companies that are positive on sustainability, should welcome an ambitious global plastic treaty and be shaping their business to adapt to it. And with that, I hand back to Nicole to talk about how engagement with petchem corporates is critical as we approach INC5.
Thanks so much, Richard. So yes, as Richard said, we've now heard about the issues that plastics are posing, the role petrochemicals play in it, the reputational, litigation, and financial risks associated with petrochemicals and plastics. And we also discussed the policy developments. And there has been a group of investors who have been paying close attention and started to address these issues. If we go to the next slide. During the summer, a group of 73 investors representing 6.8 trillion of assets under management have come together and launched a statement calling on petrochemical companies to reduce fossil fuel dependency and eliminate hazardous chemicals in plastics. These investors have come together to demand transparency, push for the development of safer alternatives, and ensure that petrochemical companies set clear, actionable targets for reducing the reliance on fossil fuels and toxic chemicals. And they are requesting petrochemical companies to publicly support an ambitious international legally binding instrument for ending plastic pollution. And as Richard mentioned, the key part here is the ambitious part, meaning that investors expect petrochemical companies to support the full life cycle of plastics being reflected in the treaty, including primary plastic polymer production. And the statement is a catalyst to engage with petrochemical companies on the role they play in plastic pollution. And to help investors engage with companies successfully, we have launched a shareholder engagement guide. This guide serves as a resource and helps investors to dive deeper into the asks and provides guidance on what topics to engage on and what questions to ask. And momentum is growing. Together with investors and other organizations, we have been making some significant advancements in this space. After launching the statement and the guide, the investors started engaging with petrochemical companies. You can see a few examples of companies we engaged with on this slide. And it is important to note that investors who are signing the statement can join these engagements and get access to all the company replies. But we've also seen developments in the policy space. Richard just mentioned it as well. There's a significant shift. The US is now indicating to support the inclusion of the reduction of plastic production in the treaty, which is a really big step. And organizations like ours and our statement, together with others, have been advocating for the US to take the latest scientific evidence into account. So that is a much welcomed change in their stance. At the same time, we've been seeing changes on litigation, lawsuits piling in. Richard has mentioned some of them as well, but just to highlight, last month, the state of California has been issued a lawsuit linking petrochemical companies and plastic pollution directly. And as Planet Tracker, we have been advocating also at key moments, including the UN General Assembly and New York Climate Week in September. We currently have colleagues on the ground in Colombia at the Biodiversity COP engaging on plastics, and we will be attending the final round of the Plastics Treaty negotiations in Busan in November and advocating on behalf of the investors on the demands in front of negotiators. And there's still time to be a part of this group and support the statement and these actions. We believe now, ahead of the final round of the Global Plastics Treaty negotiations, is a very critical time to act. The statement remains open for another 3 weeks, and we welcome investors who would like to address the role of petrochemical companies in plastic pollution. So please come and join the other investors who have already signed the statement. You can find the details of how to sign up just on the slide here. You'll find the details on our website. My colleague also just posted a link in the chat that will take you to the website. But if you do have any further questions on it, on how to get involved, what that entails, please feel free to reach out to me and to discuss this in more detail, or to just simply put your questions into the chat. We have a few more minutes of this webinar left, and we'd be happy to answer any questions from any of you if you're thinking of joining. Equally, if you have any questions on any of the other topics and themes mentioned, you can also just add your questions into the chat. We got a question on the engagement, on how often these engagements take place. So just to give you a little bit of background on that, these engagements are investor-led, so it's completely voluntary if you do want to engage with petrochemical companies or not. If you do wish to engage, there are others who are also engaging on these companies, and you can join forces using the Petrochemical Engagement Guide as a resource to engage with these companies. How often you will engage will depend on you and the other investors in the group. And if you are thinking of addressing petrochemical companies, but you do not want to engage with them, that's also fine. It's not a prerequisite to sign the statement. Equally, we also encourage investors who hold investments across the plastic value chain to address petrochemical companies. So even if you do not hold any petrochemical companies directly, you might still want to join. Others have done the same, and we encourage you to still take a stand on that. Perfect. I'll stick around if you do have any further questions, because we do have a bit more time left. But this brings us to the end of today's webinar. Hopefully that was kind of short and sweet, but as we said, we encourage you to join us. All the resources are on the website. You'll find the shareholder engagement guide there as well, if you do want to have a look and flick through it. If you do have any questions that you don't want to post in the chat here, please just reach out directly and we'd be happy to chat to you. Thank you.